girlfriend at that time. Very sentimental for me to come back here. Anyway, so this is a book about the history of income and wealth distribution. And let me make very clear about the fact that there's a little bit of economics in the book as well, but it's mostly a book about history. And the first objective of the book is to put together a lot of historical data on income and wealth that we've been collecting with many colleagues from over 20 countries, and there are over 30 people that have been involved in this data collection process. And I really want to stress this collective nature of the book because sometimes I read that this is a French book, and this is not a French book in any way. This comes from a very international project. So I first started collecting historical data on income and wealth in France 15 years ago. Then Tony Atkinson, who is a very distinguished British economist, and who is in a way the godfather of many of the historical studies on income and wealth inequality, who wrote in 1978 a very important book using inheritance data for Britain and looking at the historical evolution of wealth inequality in Britain. And he's been a major contributor to this historical database that we have been collecting. And more generally, there's a long tradition of British economists who are concerned with the study of inequality, the study of inheritance, the study of wealth, from John Stuart Mill to James Mill. And there's also a long British tradition of thinking about progressive taxation of income and wealth, which was invented in Britain and partly in the United States much more than in the continent. And it's important to be aware of that. And I think one of the reasons for putting this issue of inequality into this broad historical perspective is to not lose this memory, which I think is important not only for the sake of history, but also to look at the future. So anyway, many people have contributed to this data collection process. With Emmanuel Saez, we've been studying the case of the US. With Facundo Azaredo, we looked at Argentina. With Alexis Banerjee at India. Postel Vinay, Rosenthal, Zuckman have worked with me on collecting historical data on wealth and inheritance rather than income. So, the book also includes part 4 about the future and about policy conclusion for the future, but let me make very clear that you can very well disagree with everything that's in part 4 and still find some interest in part 1, 2, and 3. So, I am much better at analyzing the past than the future, like every one of us, and I don't pretend, I try to draw the most reasonable conclusion for the future from the basis of historical evidence, but I don't pretend these are the only possible conclusions. I think we are in the social sciences, we are not going to turn the study of the history of income and wealth into an exact science. And ultimately, the objective of this research is to contribute to a more informed public debate and to help everybody to sort of write their own part 4 and their own conclusion. So, I will give you some of my conclusions, but I think part 1, 2, and 3 are actually 90% of the book and are probably more important than the last 10%. Okay, so there is really 2 sets of data that I put together on this book. Data on income and data on wealth. And to a large extent, this book is trying to shift the attention from income to wealth. So of course, both are important, and wealth is partly the result of accumulation of saving out of income, so both are very related. But wealth is a more complicated object than income because it also involves inherited wealth, it involves natural resources that have not been saved by anyone. So it's and also the concentration of wealth is always higher than income, so it induces even a stronger political fight and dispute. And this book is trying to argue that we have to look not only at the rise of income inequality, but also the dynamics of wealth inequality and concentration. So the first part of the data on income comes from this World Top Income database. So I'm sorry that the colors are not very visible, but some countries in red, which are the countries that are already in the database, and the countries in blue are about to enter the database. So being in this World Top Income database means that we use all the historical data on income, particularly coming from the income tax, that can be used in order to compute series on income inequality. So the modern progressive income tax was introduced in Britain in 1908, 1909, in the US in 1913, in France in 1914, in India in 1922, in Japan and Germany it was a bit earlier, in the late 19th century. So we start, between 1900 and 1920, sometimes 1890 in Russia or Japan, but basically around 1900, 1920, you have data on income, which it takes a long time to collect the data, to try to make meaningful series out of this raw material, so I'm not going to spend time about the details. This is the typical outcome you get out of this data, and this is what you get from the United States. So this is the share of total income going to the top 10% of the distribution. So it's a very simple indicator of inequality. So as you can see, during the first part of the 20th century, you have an important decline in income inequality. And then, in the past 3 decades, you have a quite spectacular rise in the share going to the top 10%. So the share of total income going to the top 10% was sort of stable between, a little bit below 35%, between 30 and 35% in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and then it has increased up to almost 50%. In fact, I have not put on this graph the most recent data point, which is for 2012, where it's a little bit above 50%, like 51%. So the latest data point we put there is online with Emmanuel Saez a couple of months ago, but it was not ready at the time of the book. So the trend seems to be continuing. Okay? Now, the first part of the decline in income inequality is what Kuznets found in the 1950s. Okay, so Kuznets was the Ukrainian-born American economist who computed the first GDP series for the US, and then his next task in the 50s was to use this very same income tax data that we've been using for the US from 1913 to 1948, and what he found is a very large decline in the share of national income going to the top 10%. Now, all what we've been doing in this work and with this database is to extend the work of Kuznets to many more countries. So instead, and longer time period. So instead of having one country over a 35-year period, which is all what Kuznets had, we have over 20 countries over an entire century. But our methods and data are basically the same as Kuznets. So it's just that with the modern information technology, we can produce and use much larger volumes of data. Also, maybe one reason why it was not done before, which I think is a bit sad, is the sort of very sharp boundaries between the social sciences, and collecting this historical data probably was, for many people, too historical for economists and too economic for historians, and so nobody was doing it. But it's just a lot of time, a lot of work, but it's just extending what Kuznets did. Now, as you can see, this changes quite a lot the perception also of the substance of the matter, because in the 50s, 60s, Kuznets came with very optimistic conclusion, saying that you have basically a decline in inequality in advanced stages of development. And indeed, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, there was quite a lot of optimism with the view, these very strong views about balanced growth. When you have a stable share going to the top 10%, it means that all income groups benefit from aggregate growth. We have the same growth rate for top 10% income, for bottom 90% income, so we have very balanced distribution of income gains. Whereas in the recent period, this very large increase means that over the 30-year period between 1980 and 2010, you have between 2/3 and 3/4 of aggregate US income growth that went to the top 10% and most of it to the top 1%. Okay? So given that the growth performance of the US economy was not that great in this period, the per capita GDP growth of 1.5%, if you get 2/3 of that or 3/4 of that to the top 1%, it's it's not clear that this is a good deal for the rest of the population. So this has attracted a lot of attention because the trends are big. So how far is that going to go? I think nobody knows. Is that going to stabilize right at 50%? Is it going to go to 60% of total income for the top 10 in 2020? 70%? Some people seem to believe that wherever it goes will be fine because this is where the market takes us and the market rewards talent efficiently and that time. But I think at some point you have to look at the numbers. The numbers are so big. When the share of total income goes from 30% to 50% or 60%, it's not just a problem of symbolic. It's really a problem of macroeconomic significance. So a big part of the book is trying to understand these trends of income, and in particular, we try to compare with other countries. So for the UK, it will be less spectacular. It will be sort of in between stability and the US, and in continental Europe and Japan, it will be a slight rise, but almost stable. At least it will be much less spectacular than the US, and also less spectacular rise in terms of income shares in the UK. So in the book, I use studies that we have done with Emmanuel Saez and Stéphanie Stancheva trying to account for this, and what we argue is that the big rise of top managerial compensation in the US and to a lesser extent in the UK is hard to account for simply with skill-based, rising productivity of managers kind of model. Because otherwise, it's difficult to explain why it's so concentrated in certain countries and so concentrated, like in the US, it's really the top 1 or even the top 0.1%. It's not that these people have so much more education than the people right below them. So it's really hard with a pure skill-based and supply and demand for skill models to explain for what we have. And there seems to be a lot of what is happening has to do with the fact that the marginal product of top managers is quite difficult to observe. And when you have a huge reduction in the top income tax rate, and I will return to this at the end in the US and large extent in the UK as well, this probably has contributed to change to a large extent the nature of the game at the top end of the distribution of compensation and executive compensation. You have much stronger incentives when the top tax rate is 30 or 40% instead of 80% as it was in the US and the UK until the 70s. You have much stronger incentives to try to put the right people in the compensation committee so as to get 1 million more. Now, whether this is good for the performance of the company is not really visible in the data we have. When you compare companies and you compare the performance, what you observe is that the elasticity of this top managerial compensation with respect to windfall profits, so profits that are variations that are due to changes in exchange rate, changes in raw material prices or sector averages, and the elasticity of managerial compensation with respect to this windfall profit is in fact even higher than the elasticity of compensation with respect to the profits that are filtered for the sector level variations due to the actual managerial action. So it's, that doesn't look as if the incentive model is really working. It's more like when there's cash on the table, you tend to take it if you can. So anyway, that's an important part of the book, but that's not the most important part. The most important part of the book, as I explained, is to shift the attention from the rise of top income shares to the rise of wealth and wealth accumulation. So I'm going to show you another graph which looks a little bit like this, but which in fact comes from a completely different story and has nothing to do with top managerial compensation. And this graph is this one, and this measures the evolution of the capital income ratio in a number of European countries, Germany, France, UK. You can see that. So this is the value, this is aggregate net private wealth. So this is the value of what the private households own in these countries expressed as a fraction of national income. So what they own is real estate assets, financial assets, minus liability. Okay, so this is net wealth, net capital. And as you can see, you have the same kind of U-shaped curve that you have here, the huge decline following the war, the Great Depression, and then a steady increase starting in the 50s, 60s, and even more so since the 70s. Now, this process has actually very little to do with this one. This process, this graph is not really about, it's actually not at all per se about inequality. You could have a completely egalitarian society where everyone has the same share in aggregate wealth, and still you could have a rise of the wealth-to-income ratio. So the rise of the wealth-to-income ratio is not bad per se. In fact, in many ways, this is good news for European countries that they have a lot of assets. So let me show you, another graph for the higher number of countries. So here you have net private capital for the top 8 developed countries in the world in terms of GDP, US, Japan, Germany, France, UK, Italy, Canada, Australia. And you have net public capital. So net public capital is defined in the same way as net private capital. So these are public assets minus public debt. So this can be negative, like for Italy, they have negative net public capital. This means that they have more debt than assets. So even if they were to sell all the public buildings, they will still have some debt left. Now, you can see that together during the recent period, during the past few decades, you have at the same time a rise in private capital and a decline in public capital. So including in Britain, of course, because you have privatization, so you have a decline in public assets, and you have a rise in public debt. So if you have less assets and more debt, of course, the net public capital declines. And this is the same pretty much in every country. But you can also see that the increase in private capital has been a lot larger than the decline in public capital. So in other words, instead of, sometimes in Europe we behave as if we only have debt, we only have public debt, private debt, but as if Europe was owned by some mysterious entities, the Emir of Qatar, or California pension funds, or the Bank of China, or whatever. Europe is rich. European countries have never been as rich in terms of net private wealth. And if you sum private capital and public capital, you have national capital or net national wealth. And actually, this has never been as high for an entire century. You have to return to the pre-World War I period to have such a large quantity of net national capital with respect to years of GDP and national income. Okay? So this is, per se, this is good news. This means that European countries are rich. It is our governments which are poor, which is a problem, of course, and we need to find ways to get organized. But at least, our economic fundamentals are much better than what we believe. Now, the problem, of course, is the inequality of capital property. So, these are the 3 points. Actually, I think I'm going to limit myself to the first 2 points because I've been talking about America for 2 weeks now. So now I can talk about US for America, which in the end, care more on European debate than US debate, which is really good for me. So these are the 2 points that I will make. First point I just made it, which is this return of what I call a patrimonial or wealth-based society in Europe and actually also in Japan. You didn't have the time to see on my previous graph probably, but you have a huge rise in the wealth-to-income ratio in Japan and even in Europe. And in effect, your wealth-income ratio seems to be returning to very high levels in these low growth countries, because you have, in particular, you have very low population growth in recent decades in Japan and in most European countries. And that's a big difference with the US, where you have higher population growth. And this makes a big difference for the following reason. The basic intuition is that when you have a slow growth society, wealth accumulated in the past can naturally become very important. And the basic idea is that take the extreme case with zero population growth or zero population growth. If you keep saving and investing each year 10% of your national income, your capital income ratio will go to the sky. So at some point you will not know what to do with the money, and probably you will have huge real estate bubbles, and you will have And this is a little bit what we have actually. But so the only difference is that instead of having zero growth, we have slightly positive growth. So population growth and productivity growth in the past 10 years, in the past 20 to 30 years have been 1.5% on average in European countries. Now, if you there's a very simple formula that I try to explain in the book, which is that if you save 10% per year and your total GDP growth is say 1.5%, in the long run you will tend to accumulate the quantity of capital equal to 10 divided by 1.5 years of national income. That's forgetting about bubbles. So if you have real estate bubble, huge increase in asset prices, it can go even higher. Then it can go down with the bubble explode. But the sort of long-run equilibrium towards which you tend to converge can be quite large. So the basic explanation for this big rise of capital income ratio and this return to sort of very high wealth income ratios that we had in the past simply comes from the fact that with slow growth, wealth accumulated in the past naturally become very important. And in the long run, this can be relevant for the entire world, and give present some simple projections for the future. This is just using United Nations demographic projections for China and Asia, and taking as given the assumptions that we're going to have continued convergence in per capita GDP and taking current trends in saving rates. So of course that's making a lot of assumptions. That's only one possible scenario, but at least with the kind of population growth decline that we have in the standard projections, even if we keep the same productivity growth as what we've had in recent decades, there is a natural tendency of capital income ratio to rise at the global level. Now, this is not, again, this is not necessarily bad per se, but this implies that the issue of wealth and concentration of wealth and access to wealth, and how do you make sure that you have a middle class that gets a decent share in national wealth, and how do you make sure that the middle class share is not shrinking? These issues become very important when wealth becomes very important. So, this is the return of patrimonial societies. It can be very good, and it's good to have a lot of capital, but the issue of inequality of wealth becomes even more important. So my second point, and I will try to be faster, is that one important determinant of wealth inequality in the long run is the gap between R and G, where R is the rate of return to capital and G is the growth rate. And my basic point is that the higher R minus G, you tend to converge to higher inequality of wealth. So this will stop somewhere, but this will stop at a level of inequality of wealth that can be quite large. And I think this is largely what explains the very large level of wealth concentration that we've seen in the past pretty much everywhere in Europe until World War I. And I think there are reasons to believe that in the future we might return to high R minus G. Let me make clear right away, because when I make this statement, sometimes people are really surprised from a logical viewpoint, and people think that how can it be that R can be bigger than G forever? So let me make clear right away that this is exactly what you get in the most standard economic model, and even more importantly, this is what you get during most of human history. So during most of human history, the growth rate was equal to 0%. In pre-industrial revolution societies, in agrarian societies, there was zero population growth, and there was very small productivity growth. So let me show you some estimates for this. Okay, so these are estimates for growth rate over 2,000 of years. So of course, this was this is imperfect data, but the simple reason why we can be sure that the growth rates were pretty small until the Industrial Revolution is simply that even a growth rate of 0.2% or 0.3% per year during 1,000 years would imply that the population at the world level was less than 200 inhabitants at the time of Christ. And we know there is a lot of evidence showing that there was a higher population at that time, and people disagree as to whether it was 50 million, 60 million, and I don't have a strong opinion about this, but in any case, we know that from a purely logical viewpoint that growth, both for population and productivity, was very close to 0% in most of human history. Now, R bigger than G was very obvious at that time. In fact, everybody in agrarian societies knows that R was bigger than G. So people would not say it this way, but certainly if you read any novel by Jane Austen or Balzac, you will notice that everybody knows that the rate of return is somewhere between 4 and 5%. So they don't even have to say it because it is so obvious to the reader that if you want an annual income of £1,000, you need a capital of £20,000 because 5% of 20 is £1,000 per year. And everybody knows it, so that they don't even have to say it. It's just it has such important consequences for the life of these people, who they are going to marry with, the kind of life they will have, the kind of living standard, that it is vitally important. It is not only income and money matters are important matters, and so with a rate of return of 4 to 5%, of course the gap was very large. Now during the Industrial Revolution, the growth rate increased somewhat, but until World War I, the growth rates were not larger than 1.5%. Now in the 20th century, the growth rate at the world level reached very high level, over 3% in the post-war period. But it's important to realize that more than half of this 4% growth rate are due to population growth. And even today, at the world level, when we say the world GDP is going to rise at 3 or 3.5% in 2014, half of it is population. Per capita GDP is only rising at 1.5 at the world level, even accounting for China, even accounting for America. So here, all what I've done in this graph is to take the UN population projection, the central scenario, according to which population growth is going to decline pretty much everywhere. And this per se, pushes growth rate to low level and increases the gap between R and G. So, I think the only reason why this equilibrium between R and G was changed in the 20th century is really due to pretty unusual events. Large population growth is one. The other important event, of course, is that you had huge shocks to private rates of return due to World War I, World War II, the Great Depression. So here I do not take into account the capital destruction, taxation, and various shocks to capital. If I put them back in, this is what you get. So this is the after-tax and after-capital loss rate of return between 1913 and 1950 was actually below the growth rate and very small. I mean, on many assets it was actually negative, and on average, I'm not pretending these numbers are perfectly accurate, these are estimates, but I think the orders of magnitude are right. And most importantly, what has really changed during the 20th century is that due to relatively unusual events, the very sharp shocks to the rate of return, and also the very large growth performance of the post-war period, which was due partly to population growth and also partly to the recovery and the reconstruction going on in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, induced a complete reversal between the ordering for the growth rate and the rate of return. If even more concrete example of R bigger than G in the recent period will be this. Okay, so here on this table, I am using a data source that is not particularly reliable, let me say right away, which are the Forbes ranking for global billionaire. So I start in 1987 because this is when the Forbes magazine started publishing their ranking. So, it's not perfectly reliable, and it's a bit sad in a way that people have to read magazines to learn about wealth. I would prefer to buy Eurostat publications or IMF publications, but they will not find the information. So, actually, one reason why I like the progressive wealth tax idea is that because it's a way to bring more financial transparency and more public knowledge about wealth dynamics. And taxation is always a way to produce legal categories and democratic transparency of income, profits, wealth, anyway, this is the data we have, and what you see is that, okay, as we all know, from these rankings that are published not only by Forbes, but by various magazines in every country, Britain, Germany, and France, there's been a large rise in the number of billionaires. Now, this per se is not surprising with the large growth at the world level. We want to have more billionaires. What's more interesting is to look, if you take a constant fraction of the world population, how fast the average wealth of this group has been rising. Okay? And the answer is that they've been rising 3 times faster than the size of the world economy. The sense that you have, so these are not the same people all over the period. These top groups, some people move out, some new people come in, typically new billionaires from emerging countries. But if we were in an equilibrium, if we were in a steady state in the world inequality of wealth, the average wealth of this top group should rise at the same speed as average wealth at the world level. Now, this is not at all what you have, because as you can see, so world GDP growth over this period has been 3.3%, which is quite good, but in fact more than half of it corresponds to population growth, 1.9%. So the per capita GDP and per capita income has only increased by 1.4% per year over this period, which is what I was saying earlier. So a big part of the feeling of growth that we have in the world today is still coming from the rise of population. Now, the growth rate for average wealth has been larger than 1.4%, 2.1%, which corresponds to the rise in the wealth to income ratio I was describing before. But still, 2.1% is 3 times less than 6 to 7%. Okay? So, if the top of the distribution is rising 3 times faster than the average, it means that we are in a period of rising concentration of wealth. How far will this go? Where will this stop? I don't know. It's not that I have an answer to exactly what will be the threshold and what will be. I'm just saying that this can get very far faster than we think. So these simple mechanics of rate of return and growth rate. So of course it could be that we manage. I hear some reviews saying growth rate, we just have to increase growth rate, etc. Okay, if we can increase growth rate to 4 or 5% per year, that would be great. And in case this happens and we won't need other solutions to sort of balance this process of wealth concentration and wealth inequality, and that will be fine. But I think we should not bet on that. At least we should have another plan in case it does not happen. In case the growth rate don't go up to 4 or 5%, in case even if we do everything we can to promote innovation, invest in skills, invest in education, and of course we should do that. But even with the most we do, probably the growth rate will not be that much larger than 1.5, 2%. In the long run, that's already quite fast productivity growth. That's enough to renew at each generation in the space of 30 years. 1/3 or 1/2 of the economy is being renewed when you have 1.5 productivity growth per year. That's pretty fast growth. It requires a good education system so that everybody can access the right skills, the right job. It's not small growth, but that's not going to be sufficient probably to equilibrate this process of rising concentration of wealth. So then just a few words about the solution. I think there are many different possible solutions. You have different countries will invent their own way. Inflation can be a way to redistribute wealth. Can be a way to reduce the public debt, which has been very important historically. The problem with inflation is that you don't only destroy the public debt, you also destroy the wealth of people who only have saving accounts. So typically this is like a tax on low wealth holders, whereas higher wealth portfolio, with stock and real estate, the price of equity or the price of real estate will probably rise with inflation, so they will not be hurt at all by inflation. So it's like inflation is like a regressive wealth tax, if you wish. So I tend to prefer the progressive wealth tax, which is a way, the civilized form of inflation. So it's not the same thing, but you can protect people, below. So I make some, proposal of what a tax rate could look like. You could have, very low or zero tax rate below 1 million euros in net wealth, and then 1% above 1 million, and then 2% above 5 million. That would, given the very large level of wealth to income ratio, that would be enough to have 2% of GDP tax revenue. So I think I'm not saying this is going to happen tomorrow morning, but I think it's worth thinking about when you have such a vibrant wealth tax base and stagnant income and stagnant wages, it would be crazy not to think about this tax base. And I think it's an issue that's beyond left and right. In Spain, Rajoy was not particularly left-wing. We introduced the wealth tax that was suppressed by Zapatero. Italy, Monti introduced the wealth tax, except that it was done in the wrong way because the tax rate on real estate was 8 times bigger than the tax rate on financial assets. So, everybody in Europe was saying that Monti was a genius of the public finance, but the Italians did not agree because the Italians thought, okay, I pay, when I have a small house of 100,000 euros, I pay a tax rate 8 times bigger than someone with billions of euros in financial assets. That doesn't sound right. And I think the problem is that if you don't have more fiscal cooperation, it's difficult to have as much progressivity as you would like. Still, individual countries can make progress. You can have a more progressive system of taxation on net wealth, including the UK or in France or in the US. If you have a higher tax rate on mansions, that doesn't mean that mansions will cross the channel immediately and go to France. So some progress can be made with the progressive taxation of wealth just at the national level. And then, I think more generally the history of taxation is full of surprises, and let me conclude maybe by this. If you look at the history of top income tax rates over the past century, and so here you have 4 countries, the US, the UK, Germany, and France. Many people 100 years ago, in 1900, 1910, would predict that the progressive income tax would never happen, and then things happen. And sometimes governments don't plan in advance what they are going to do. In France, it was the right-wing government of the early 20s that suddenly introduced steeply progressive taxation of income, whereas in 1940s they didn't want an income tax, even with a tax rate of 2%. So sometimes things change, and not only because of war, but also because of financial crises, and because also the democratic institutions can respond to concerns and growing concerns about inequality. So, and even at the international level, let me conclude with this. 5 years ago, nobody would have said that it was possible to do something with the Swiss banks and bank secrecy in Switzerland, and then there were sanctions by the US government, and there was a change in the transmission of information from Swiss banks to other countries. And I'm quite sad that European countries were not able to tackle the problem before, because in a way, European countries have a lot more to lose than the US from Switzerland and European tax havens. But this shows that things can change sometime. And this is a pretty chaotic history. As you can see, the US and the UK are really the countries that have invented progressive taxation at very high levels of income and also of inheritance. If you look at these are the top tax rates for inheritance, you also see that France and Germany have always been historically much more cautious and much more reasonable, if you want, with top tax rates than the US and the UK. The only time, you can see that the only time in history where Germany has a 90% top tax rate was between 1946 and 1948, and this is when their tax policy is set as the Americans. No, but really, this is the Allied Control Council that sets the tax policy of Germany, and when the Bundesrepublik gets it back its sovereignty in 1950, they reduced the tax rate immediately to what they view as to much more reasonable level as compared to this crazy American and Anglo-Saxon levels. And this was the same in Japan. You know, in Japan, the many years where we have a 90% tax rate is 1948, 1948. And now the US were not doing that to punish the Germans or the Japanese because they were doing the same at home. So this was not a punishment. This was part of the civilization package of the time, in the sense that the Americans wanted to bring democratic institutions and also the fiscal institutions that prevent democracies from becoming plutocracies and from developing excessive concentration of wealth, which in the end turned against the democratic process. And this was also a strong concern in this country. Very nice book in our period of Wedgwood talking about inheritance in the UK, and the last edition before the war in 1938 concludes that political democracies to be sustainable also need to democratize wealth, to democratize property. And I think it's important when we study these issues to realize that they have not started 10 years ago, they are part of a long history. And I don't know what's going to happen next, but again, I think we should not take advantage that nothing will ever change. And this is the story of income and wealth is not just an economic history. It is a political, cultural, social histories, and